never thought I'd be the one fighting my own family over my grandmother's legacy, but sometimes you discover that the people you've trusted your entire life are capable of betrayal and greed beyond anything you could have imagined. What happened after my beloved grandmother passed away 2 years ago turned into a nightmare of manipulation, lies, and theft that nearly destroyed our family forever, but it also led to the discovery of a secret that changed everything and proved that my grandmother was smarter and more protective than any of us had ever realized. My name is Sarah, I'm 34 years old, and this story begins with the woman who practically raised me and shaped who I became as a person. My grandmother, Eleanor, was the heart of our family for as long as I could remember, the one person who always had time for everyone's problems and somehow managed to hold us all together through good times and bad. She lived in the same beautiful Victorian house for over 60 years, the place where she'd raised my father and his siblings, where all the grandchildren had spent countless summers and holidays, and where every major family celebration had taken place for decades. Grandma Eleanor was 91 when she passed away peacefully in her sleep, and while we were all heartbroken to lose her, there was some comfort in knowing that she'd lived a long, full life surrounded by people who loved her. She'd been sharp and independent right up until the end, managing her own finances, maintaining her house, and staying actively involved in all our lives. She was the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthdays, kept track of our accomplishments and struggles, and somehow always knew exactly what to say to make you feel better about whatever was going wrong in your life. I was especially close to Grandma Eleanor because I'd lived with her during high school after my parents went through a messy divorce, and she'd been my anchor during one of the most difficult periods of my life. She'd helped me with homework, listened to my teenage drama, and given me the kind of unconditional love and support that allowed me to thrive despite the chaos happening in my parents' marriage. Living in her house had been like living in a sanctuary, surrounded by decades of family history and the kind of stability that only comes from being with someone who's seen everything and somehow managed to maintain her optimism and grace. My 2 older brothers, Michael and David, had also been close to Grandma Eleanor, though their relationships with her were more complicated than mine. Michael, who's 5 years older than me, had always been the golden child in our family, the one who excelled at everything and seemed to have life figured out by the time he was 25. He'd become a successful real estate developer, married a lovely woman named Jennifer, and had 2 kids who were the apple of Grandma Eleanor's eye. David, 3 years older than me, had taken a different path, working as a freelance contractor and living a more bohemian lifestyle that sometimes worried our traditional grandmother, but which she'd learned to accept because she loved him unconditionally. The 3 of us had always gotten along reasonably well, despite the typical sibling rivalries and personality differences that exist in most families. Michael could be controlling and condescending sometimes, especially when it came to family decisions where he thought his success in business gave him special authority. David could be irresponsible and unreliable, often making commitments he couldn't keep or asking for financial help when his projects didn't work out as planned. But we'd always managed to work through our differences and present a united front when it came to taking care of Grandma Eleanor and making sure she had the support she needed as she got older. In the months before Grandma Eleanor passed away, we'd had several family meetings about her care and her future plans. She was still living independently in her big house, but we were all aware that at 91, she might eventually need more assistance or different living arrangements. Michael had been pushing for her to move to an assisted living facility, arguing that the house was too big for her to maintain and that she'd be safer and more social in a community setting. David and I were more reluctant to push for changes, feeling like she should be able to make her own decisions about where and how she wanted to live. Grandma Eleanor had been characteristically diplomatic about these discussions, listening to everyone's opinions but making it clear that she intended to stay in her house as long as she was physically and mentally capable of doing so. She'd hired a housekeeper to help with cleaning and some of the heavier maintenance tasks, and she'd arranged for grocery delivery and other services that made it easier for her to age in place. She seemed to have everything well organized and under control, which was typical of her approach to most aspects of life. The subject of inheritance and what would happen to her house and possessions after she passed away had come up occasionally in these family conversations, but Grandma Eleanor had always been vague about the specifics. She'd mentioned that she had a will and that everything had been taken care of legally, but she'd never shared the details with any of us. This wasn't unusual for her generation, many of whom considered discussion of inheritance to be morbid or inappropriate, so none of us pushed her for information we figured we'd learn eventually. What we did know was that the house itself was incredibly valuable, having appreciated significantly over the decades she'd owned it. It was located in a historic neighborhood that had become very desirable, and the Victorian architecture and large lot made it the kind of property that real estate developers coveted. Michael had mentioned several times that if the house ever came on the market, it would probably sell for well over $1 million, which was a substantial amount of money for a family like ours that had always been middle class rather than wealthy. If you've ever been part of a family where significant inheritance is involved, you probably understand how these financial considerations can create tension and anxiety even when no one wants to admit they're thinking about them, and I'd love to hear how others have navigated similar situations because the dynamics can be so complicated and emotionally charged. When Grandma Eleanor passed away in her sleep on a Tuesday morning in March, we were all devastated but also faced with the immediate practical concerns that come with losing a family member. There were funeral arrangements to make, relatives to notify, and dozens of legal and financial matters that needed to be addressed. Michael immediately took charge of most of these responsibilities, which seemed natural given his business experience and his tendency to assume leadership roles in family situations. The funeral was beautiful and well attended, with family members, longtime friends, and neighbors all coming to pay their respects to a woman who'd touched so many lives over the years. Grandma Eleanor had been active in her church, various community organizations, and local historical preservation efforts, so there were people there who knew her from many different contexts. The service was a celebration of her life and all the ways she'd made her community and her family better through her presence and her generous spirit. In the days immediately following the funeral, we focused on the emotional aspects of grieving and supporting each other through the loss. But within about a week, practical concerns started to take precedence, particularly the question of what would happen to Grandma Eleanor's house and possessions. Michael suggested that we needed to meet with her lawyer as soon as possible to review her will and understand our responsibilities as her heirs, which seemed like reasonable advice. The meeting with Grandma Eleanor's lawyer, Mr. Patterson, was scheduled for the following Friday at his downtown office. Michael, David, and I all attended, along with Jennifer, who came to support Michael and help with any paperwork or logistics that needed to be managed. Mr. Patterson had been Grandma Eleanor's attorney for over 20 years, handling various legal matters for her and serving as the executor of her estate, so we expected him to have all the information we needed about her final wishes and the distribution of her assets. What we learned in that meeting was both surprising and disappointing, though at the time I didn't realize just how much information was being withheld from us. According to Mr. Patterson, Grandma Eleanor's will was relatively straightforward, dividing her assets equally among her 3 grandchildren with a few small bequests to charitable organizations she'd supported over the years. The house, which was by far her most valuable asset, was to be sold with the proceeds split 3 ways between Michael, David, and me. This arrangement made sense and seemed fair to all of us, though I felt a pang of sadness at the thought of selling the house, where so many of our family memories had been created. Michael was clearly pleased with the financial implications of inheriting a third of the house's value, and David seemed relieved that he'd have some money to help stabilize his somewhat precarious financial situation. We agreed that Michael would take the lead on preparing the house for sale, given his experience in real estate, and that we'd work together to sort through Grandma Eleanor's possessions and decide what to do with family heirlooms and personal items. The process of cleaning out Grandma Eleanor's house was emotionally difficult but also meaningful in its way. We spent several weekends going through decades of accumulated belongings, sharing memories about different items, and deciding what should be kept within the family versus what could be donated or disposed of. There were boxes of old photographs, handwritten letters, vintage clothing, books, furniture, and countless other items that told the story of a long and well-lived life. During this process, I noticed that Michael seemed to be taking a very businesslike approach to everything, focusing on what items might have monetary value rather than sentimental significance. He'd bring in appraisers to evaluate antiques and artwork, research the market value of various collectibles, and generally treat the house-like inventory that needed to be processed and liquidated as efficiently as possible. While I understood that there were practical considerations involved, his approach felt cold and impersonal given that we were dealing with our beloved grandmother's lifetime of memories and possessions. David, on the other hand, seemed overwhelmed by the whole process and often failed to show up for scheduled sorting sessions or left early when the emotional weight of going through Grandma Eleanor's things became too much for him. This left most of the actual work to Michael and me, which created some tension since David was going to benefit equally from the eventual sale of the house without contributing equally to the effort required to prepare it for market. About 6 weeks after Grandma Eleanor's death, Michael announced that he'd been working with a real estate agent to get the house appraised and that they'd identified several potential buyers who were interested in the property. He said that with some minor renovations and staging, the house could probably sell for around $1.2 million, which would give each of us approximately $400,000 after taxes and fees. This was more money than any of us had ever had at one time. And the prospect of such a significant windfall was both exciting and overwhelming, but then Michael dropped a bombshell that completely changed the dynamic of our family relationships and started a chain of events that would consume the next year and a half of our lives. He told David and me that he'd been thinking about the situation and had decided that rather than selling the house to strangers, he wanted to buy out our shares and keep the property in the family. He said that he and Jennifer had always loved the house and could envision raising their children there, surrounded by all the family history and memories that made the place special. On the surface, this sounded like a reasonable and even touching proposal. Michael offered to pay David and me each $300,000 for our shares of the house, which was less than we'd get if the house sold for full market value, but still a substantial amount of money. He presented this as a generous offer that would allow him to preserve the family homestead while giving us immediate cash without the hassles and uncertainties of putting the house on the open market. David was immediately enthusiastic about Michael's proposal, probably because $300,000 in cash would solve most of his financial problems and allow him to pursue some business ventures he'd been dreaming about. I was more hesitant, partly because the financial difference was significant and partly because something about the whole situation felt rushed and incomplete. I asked for time to think about the offer and maybe get my own appraisal of the house's value before making a decision. This request seemed to annoy Michael, who said that getting multiple appraisals would just delay everything and create unnecessary complications. He pointed out that his offer was generous and guaranteed, whereas selling on the open market involved risks and could take months to complete. He also made emotional arguments about keeping the house in the family and preserving Grandma Eleanor's legacy, suggesting that rejecting his offer would be disrespectful to her memory and harmful to family unity. The pressure Michael was applying made me increasingly uncomfortable, and I started to suspect that there might be more to his eagerness to acquire the house than simple sentiment or family loyalty. I decided to do my own research into the property's value and the real estate market in that neighborhood, and what I discovered made me very concerned about the deal Michael was proposing. According to my independent research, houses in Grandma Eleanor's neighborhood were selling for significantly more than Michael had indicated, and her property was particularly valuable because of its large lot, historic character, and excellent condition. A real estate agent I consulted privately told me that the house would likely sell for at least $1.5 million and possibly more if it were marketed correctly to buyers looking for historic properties in desirable neighborhoods. This meant that Michael's offer of $300,000 per share was based on a significantly undervalued assessment of the house, and that he stood to gain hundreds of thousands of dollars by essentially tricking David and me into accepting less than our fair share of the inheritance. When I confronted him with this information, his reaction was defensive and dismissive, claiming that my research was flawed and that his experience in real estate gave him better insight into the property's true market value. The conversation escalated into an argument that revealed some ugly dynamics in our sibling relationships that I'd never fully recognized before. Michael became condescending and patronizing, suggesting that I was being naive and ungrateful by questioning his expertise and his generous offer. He implied that David and I should be thankful that he was willing to keep the house in the family, rather than letting it be sold to developers who might tear it down or drastically alter its character. David, unfortunately, sided with Michael in this dispute, partly because he desperately needed the money and partly because he'd always deferred to Michael's judgment in family matters. This left me in the position of being the difficult, greedy sibling, who was holding up a perfectly reasonable family arrangement for selfish reasons. The whole situation was incredibly stressful and hurtful, and it started to damage my relationships with both of my brothers in ways that I hadn't anticipated. Despite the family pressure, I held firm in my position that the house should be properly appraised and sold at fair market value, with the proceeds split equally as Grandma Eleanor's will specified. This led to several more heated arguments and ultimately to a decision by Michael and David to move forward with legal action to force the sale of the property on their preferred terms. They hired a lawyer who specialized in estate disputes and began the process of trying to compel me to accept Michael's buyout offer or agree to a quick sale at the price they determined. The legal maneuvering that followed was expensive, stressful, and emotionally devastating for all of us. What had started as a family disagreement about money had escalated into a full-blown legal battle that threatened to destroy our relationships permanently. I hired my own attorney to protect my interests and ensure that Grandma Eleanor's will was executed properly, which meant that much of our potential inheritance was being spent on legal fees rather than benefiting any of us. During this period, I also started to suspect that Michael and David were not being entirely honest with me about other aspects of Grandma Eleanor's estate. There were inconsistencies in the information they were sharing about her financial accounts, personal property, and other assets that made me wonder whether they were trying to hide something or manipulate the situation to their advantage. My attorney advised me to request a full accounting of all estate assets and to insist on transparency in all aspects of the probate process. The breakthrough came about 8 months after Grandma Eleanor's death, when my attorney discovered that there were significant discrepancies between the will that had been presented to us and some of the financial records and legal documents associated with the estate. Further investigation revealed that Michael and David had apparently been working with a different attorney than Mr. Patterson and had somehow gained control of some of Grandma Eleanor's assets before her death, possibly through power of attorney. Arrangements that I'd never been informed about. This discovery led to a much more extensive investigation of the entire estate, including a review of all of Grandma Eleanor's legal and financial records for the months and years leading up to her death. What we found was evidence of a complex scheme that Michael and David had apparently been planning and implementing for several years, designed to ensure that they would inherit the majority of Grandma Eleanor's wealth while minimizing my share. The scheme involved several different tactics, including convincing Grandma Eleanor to sign financial documents that gave them control over some of her accounts, arranging for valuable items to be removed from her house before her death, and apparently working with an unscrupulous attorney to create legal documents that would override her original will and testament. The whole operation was sophisticated and carefully planned, suggesting that this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision but rather a long-term strategy to defraud me of my rightful inheritance. The most shocking part of this discovery was realizing that my brothers had been lying to me for months, not just about the value of the house but about the entire structure of Grandma Eleanor's estate and their own roles in managing it. They'd presented themselves as simply following the instructions in her will, when in reality they'd been actively manipulating the situation to their advantage and hoping I'd never discover the truth about what they'd done. When confronted with this evidence, Michael and David initially denied any wrongdoing and claimed that everything they'd done had been with Grandma Eleanor's knowledge and approval. They said that she'd been worried about my financial responsibility and had asked them to ensure that her assets were managed properly after her death. This was particularly hurtful because it suggested that Grandma Eleanor hadn't trusted me with money, which was completely contrary to everything I knew about our relationship and her opinion of me. But as the investigation continued and more evidence was uncovered, it became clear that Michael and David's story didn't hold up to scrutiny. The financial documents they claimed Grandma Eleanor had signed showed signs of forgery, the timeline of events didn't match their explanations, and several witnesses came forward to contradict their version of what had happened in the months before her death. The most damaging evidence came when my attorney discovered that there had been a second attorney involved in the situation, someone who'd apparently helped Michael and David create fraudulent documents and establish financial arrangements that were designed to bypass the legitimate probate process. This attorney had since fled the state and was being investigated by law enforcement for various fraudulent activities, which suggested that Michael and David had been involved with someone they knew was operating outside the bounds of legal and ethical behavior. At this point, it was clear that we were dealing with criminal fraud rather than just a family disagreement about inheritance, and my attorney advised me to contact law enforcement and pursue criminal charges against my brothers for theft, fraud, and elder abuse. This was an incredibly difficult decision because it meant potentially sending my own brothers to prison, but it was also the only way to recover the assets they'd stolen and ensure that Grandma Eleanor's real wishes were honored. The criminal investigation that followed revealed the full scope of what Michael and David had done, and it was even worse than I'd initially suspected. They'd been systematically stealing from Grandma Eleanor for at least 2 years before her death, gradually transferring money from her accounts to their own, convincing her to sign documents she didn't understand, and removing valuable items from her house under the pretense of helping her downsize or organize her possessions. The total amount they'd stolen was over $800,000 in cash and valuable items, which represented the majority of Grandma Eleanor's life savings and many of her most precious possessions. They'd apparently been planning to use the sale of the house to cover their tracks and make it appear that her estate was smaller than it actually was, hoping that I'd never discover the missing assets or question their version of events. But just when it seemed like the investigation had uncovered the full extent of their crimes, we made a discovery that changed everything and revealed that Grandma Eleanor had been far more aware of what was happening than any of us had realized. While searching through some of her personal papers that had been stored in a safety deposit box, we found a second will that had been created just 6 months before her death, along with detailed records of every fraudulent transaction and theft that Michael and David had committed. The second will was a complete surprise to everyone involved in the case, including the attorneys and law enforcement officers who'd been investigating the fraud. It had been prepared by a different lawyer than the one who'd handled Grandma Eleanor's previous legal affairs, and it contained very specific instructions about how her estate should be handled and distributed. Most importantly, it completely disinherited Michael and David due to their theft and betrayal, leaving everything to me along with detailed explanations of why she'd made these changes. The document was accompanied by a letter addressed to me personally, written in Grandma Eleanor's familiar handwriting and explaining everything she'd discovered about Michael and David's activities. She'd apparently been aware of their theft for several months before her death but had been gathering evidence and working with her new attorney to ensure that they couldn't successfully steal her legacy or harm me financially. The letter was both heartbreaking and empowering, showing how much she'd loved and trusted me while also revealing how betrayed and disappointed she'd felt about Michael and David's behavior. In the letter, Grandma Eleanor explained that she'd first become suspicious when she'd noticed discrepancies in her bank statements and unexplained withdrawals from her accounts. When she'd asked Michael and David about these issues, they'd given her explanations that didn't make sense or tried to convince her that she was becoming confused about her finances due to her age. This had made her more determined to investigate what was really happening, and she'd eventually hired a private investigator to help her document the theft and gather evidence of their fraudulent activities. The private investigator's report, which was also included in the safety deposit box, detailed exactly how Michael and David had been stealing from her and manipulating her into signing documents that gave them access to her assets. The report also included photographs, financial records, and other evidence that clearly demonstrated their guilt and the premeditated nature of their crimes. Grandma Eleanor had been building a case against them while pretending that she was unaware of their activities, protecting herself and ensuring that justice would eventually be served. The most touching part of her letter was her explanation of why she'd decided to leave everything to me rather than trying to divide her assets equally despite Michael and David's theft. She wrote that she'd always known I was the grandchild who most shared her values of honesty, integrity, and family loyalty, and that she trusted me to use her legacy wisely and to honor her memory in ways that Michael and David had proven they could not. She said that she'd seen how hard I'd worked to build my own life and career, and that she wanted her assets to help me achieve my dreams rather than rewarding the greed and dishonesty that Michael and David had shown. The discovery of the second will and the accompanying evidence completely changed the legal landscape of the estate dispute and the criminal case against Michael and David. With Grandma Eleanor's own documentation of their crimes and her clear instructions about how her estate should be distributed, there was no longer any question about their guilt or about what she'd wanted to happen to her assets. The fraudulent will that had been presented initially was clearly invalid, and the second will became the controlling legal document for the distribution of her estate. Michael and David's reaction to this discovery was a mixture of shock, denial, and desperate attempts to challenge the validity of the second will. They hired new attorneys and tried to argue that Grandma Eleanor had been mentally incompetent when she'd created the document, or that she'd been unduly influenced by someone who'd convinced her to change her will. But the evidence clearly showed that she'd been sharp and decisive right up until her death, and that all of her actions had been carefully planned and legally sound. The criminal case against them proceeded based on the evidence Grandma Eleanor had gathered, and both Michael and David eventually pleaded guilty to multiple counts of theft and fraud in exchange for reduced sentences. Michael received 3 years in prison and was ordered to pay restitution, while David received 2 years and similar financial penalties. They also lost their professional licenses and faced significant civil lawsuits from other clients and business partners who'd been affected by their fraudulent activities. The house, which had been at the center of so much conflict and legal maneuvering, was eventually appraised at $1.7 million and became mine to do with as I wished according to Grandma Eleanor's second will. I decided to keep it rather than selling it immediately, partly because of its sentimental value and partly because Grandma Eleanor's letter had specifically mentioned that she hoped I'd consider living there and continuing the family traditions that had made the house special for so many years. Moving into Grandma Eleanor's house was both wonderful and overwhelming, surrounded by so many memories and reminders of the family history that had been preserved within its walls. I've spent the past year slowly making it my own while respecting its character and the legacy it represents, creating new memories while honoring the old ones. It's become a sanctuary and a source of strength during the difficult process of rebuilding my life after everything that happened with Michael and David. The financial inheritance from Grandma Eleanor's estate has allowed me to pay off my student loans, invest in my career, and establish the kind of financial security that I'd never had before. But more importantly, it's given me a sense of connection to my grandmother and her values that helps me navigate difficult decisions and stay focused on what really matters in life. I've used part of the money to establish a scholarship fund in her name that helps other young women pursue education and career goals, which feels like a meaningful way to honor her memory and continue her legacy of supporting others. The relationship with my brothers has been permanently damaged by their theft and betrayal, and I've had to accept that some family relationships can't be repaired when trust has been broken so completely. Michael and David have both tried to reach out to me since their release from prison, asking for forgiveness and claiming that they've learned from their mistakes, but I'm not ready to rebuild those relationships and may never be. Their actions weren't just crimes against me financially. They were betrayals of everything our family had stood for and everything Grandma Eleanor had taught us about integrity and love. The experience has taught me valuable lessons about the importance of protecting yourself legally and financially, even when dealing with family members you think you can trust. It's also shown me how crucial it is to pay attention to warning signs and trust your instincts when something doesn't feel right, even when other people are pressuring you to ignore your concerns. Grandma Eleanor's example of quietly gathering evidence while protecting herself from further harm has been an inspiration for how to handle difficult situations with both strength and wisdom. I've also learned about the power of having someone in your life who truly understands your character and values you for who you are rather than what you can provide for them. Grandma Eleanor's faith in me and her decision to protect my inheritance was a gift that went far beyond the financial value of her estate. It was a validation of the relationship we'd built over the years and a reminder that authentic love and support don't come with conditions or expectations of reciprocal benefits. The legal and emotional aftermath of this situation has taken nearly 2 years to fully resolve, but I'm finally in a place where I can look forward rather than constantly dealing with the fallout from my brother's crimes. I've built a new life in Grandma Eleanor's house, surrounded by friends and chosen family who share her values of honesty and integrity. I've also started dating someone wonderful who appreciates both the house's history and my commitment to using my inheritance responsibly and meaningfully. One of the most satisfying aspects of how everything turned out is knowing that Grandma Eleanor was able to outsmart Michael and David and ensure that her real wishes were honored despite their attempts to defraud me. Her intelligence, planning, and determination to protect her legacy and the grandchild who'd remained loyal to her values resulted in justice being served and her assets being distributed according to her true intentions rather than the fraudulent scheme they'd created. The house itself has become a symbol of resilience and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult and costly to do so. Every room holds memories of family gatherings and celebrations, but now it also represents the triumph of honesty over greed and the power of preparation and planning in protecting the people and things you care about most. I've started hosting family gatherings again, but now they're composed of friends and extended family members who share Grandma Eleanor's values rather than people who see family relationships as opportunities for personal gain. I still think about Michael and David sometimes and feel sad about how differently things could have turned out if they'd chosen honesty over greed and family loyalty over personal enrichment. We could have all inherited substantial amounts and maintained our family relationships, creating positive memories in Grandma Eleanor's house for future generations. Instead, their choices destroyed those possibilities and created pain and division that will likely last for the rest of our lives, but I've also come to understand that their actions revealed something about their character that was probably always there, even if I hadn't wanted to acknowledge it. The elaborate nature of their theft and fraud showed that this wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment but rather a fundamental willingness to exploit people they were supposed to love and protect. Grandma Eleanor's decision to disinherit them wasn't just about punishment. It was about recognizing that they demonstrated values that were incompatible with the legacy she wanted to leave. The story of the secret will has become something of a legend in our community, partly because it involved such dramatic twists and turns and partly because it represents a satisfying example of justice being served despite attempts at deception and fraud. Several people have told me that Grandma Eleanor's story has inspired them to review their own estate planning and take steps to protect their assets from potential family conflicts or dishonest relatives. I've also spoken at estate planning seminars and family financial workshops about the importance of clear communication, proper documentation, and protective measures when dealing with significant inheritance or family wealth. Grandma Eleanor's example of quietly gathering evidence while protecting herself legally has become a case study for how to handle situations where family members might be taking advantage of elderly relatives or manipulating inheritance situations. For their own benefit, the experience has made me much more aware of the signs of financial elder abuse and the importance of providing support and resources for older family members who might be vulnerable to exploitation. I've become involved with local organizations that work to prevent elder abuse and provide legal assistance to seniors who are dealing with financial fraud or family conflicts related to inheritance and estate planning. Looking back on everything that happened, I'm grateful for the hard lessons it taught me about trust, family dynamics, and the importance of protecting yourself legally and financially. While I wouldn't wish the experience on anyone, it's also shown me that it's possible to emerge stronger and wiser from even the most difficult family conflicts when you have the support of people who truly care about you and share your values. The house continues to be a source of joy and connection to Grandma Eleanor's memory, and I've started thinking about how I want to handle my own estate planning to ensure that future generations can benefit from the legacy she worked so hard to preserve and protect. I want to make sure that the lessons she taught about integrity, planning, and family loyalty continue to influence our family story for years to come. The secret will that changed everything wasn't just a legal document, it was Grandma Eleanor's final gift to me and her last act of love and protection. It showed me that even when it seems like dishonest people are winning and getting away with their crimes, justice can still prevail if you're smart enough to plan ahead and brave enough to stand up for what's right. Her legacy lives on not just in the beautiful house I've inherited, but in the values she instilled and the example she set of how to handle life's challenges with grace, intelligence, and unwavering moral courage. If you've made it through this long story, I hope it serves as both a cautionary tale about family greed and a reminder that sometimes the people who seem most vulnerable are actually the strongest and most strategic of all. Grandma Eleanor's secret was her way of ensuring that love and loyalty would ultimately triumph over greed and betrayal, and I'm honored to be the guardian of her legacy and the beneficiary of her wisdom and planning.